Chapter 10. Sunday dissolved into dreamless sleep. No kids, no girls, no talking bicycles or bossy cars or chatty transport of any kind. When the alarm went on Monday morning, Paul tumbled out of bed feeling brighter and livelier than he could remember. He had a feeling that something horrible was now over, and he wouldn't have to go back there again. The Mortensen piles had vanished from his desk. It was clear, apart from a page torn out of a small notebook, with a few words scribbled on it in Countess Judy's praying mantis handwriting. P.A.C. Work satisfactory. C. Christine regards office management assignment. J.D.C.B. Fine, Paul thought. He knew what office management meant in J.W.W. speak. Shifting furniture, or helping with the photocopying, or replacing a starter motor in the fluorescent lighting tubes. Any one of the above was vastly preferable to sorting Mortensen printouts, so he fairly sprinted up the stairs to find out what he had to do. That filing cabinet, Christine explained. Paul nodded. It's in the Countess de Castelbianco's office now, isn't it? Christine frowned. Yes, she replied. Fancy you knowing that. Anyhow, it's got to come out of there and go into the cashier's room. You won't be able to manage it all by yourself on the stairs, though. I could try, Paul said, trying to sound feeble and undernourished. What, and chip all the paint in the stairwell? No. I'll give Mr. Suslowich a ring. He might have a minute or two. Much to Paul's relief, Mr. Suslowich wasn't there. Paul had only spoken to him a few times, and on each occasion he had found him unnervingly pleasant for a partner, but he was still the boss, not to mention a giant, albeit a rather short one. Damn, Christine said. Usually I get Benny Shumway to help with this sort of thing. I'd help you myself, but I did my back-in last week at aerobics, and it's an enchanted filing cabinet, so you can't just magic it. You'd probably blow up the building. She tutted for a moment or so. This is a pain. The Countess told me to get it shifted this morning. Priority. If it occurred to Paul to wonder why moving a filing cabinet into the cashier's office was so important to a senior member of the partnership, he did not dwell on the issue. How about Mr. Tanner's... Rosie, he amended quickly. I mean, they're quite strong, aren't they? Christine arched an eyebrow at him, but swivelled around to her phone and keyed in a number. A minute or so later, the door opened and a petite, fragile-looking Chinese beauty walked in, wearing a pale blue silk dress and 4-inch heels. Christine looked at her and clicked her tongue. Thanks for helping out, she said tersely. You might want to change, though. Wouldn't want you to risk you straining something. Mr. Tanner's mum's laugh was like the distant tinkling of silver bells in a still air of morning. Get stuffed, Chris, she said. I could carry a titchy little thing like that balanced on my nose. Paul edged sideways an inch or so. In that case, he muttered, maybe you won't be needing me after all. Perhaps I should just... No, you don't, love, chirruped Mr. Tanner's mum. I've been wondering what you would look like all sweaty. Talking of which, has some joker turned the heating down? This place was like a fridge all yesterday. Christine shrugged. Nothing to do with her. I'll leave you two to it then, she said. If you go now, the Countess is downstairs with clients in the boardroom. You won't have to disturb her. The thought of going into Countess Judy's office bothered Paul, but he couldn't very well say anything. Furthermore, all the way down the stairs and through the maze of corridors, he had to put up with Mr. Tanner's mum leering at him in a way that elicited at least one snigger from a passing secretary. Have you got to do that? He muttered, as she licked her lips for the third time in as many minutes. For crying out loud, Paul, I'm a goblin, she snapped. It's like cats with bits of string. It's not a conscious decision or anything. You don't think I'm not sick to the back teeth chasing about after you, she sighed. It's practically a duty. The sooner I've dealt with you, the sooner I can get on. It's like those computer games, where you've got to beat the dead boring level before you can move up to the interesting ones. Even with the door closed, Paul could tell from the outside that Countess Judy wasn't in her room. It was the difference between a light bulb turned on and off. Even so, he knocked on the door and counted to 30 before cautiously turning the handle and going in. Bugger, he said aloud. Are we in the right room? Behind him, Mr. Tanner's mum laughed. Think about it, she said. Bare walls, plain wooden floorboards, a ratty old chipboard desk, a plastic stacking chair in the filing cabinet. Paul couldn't help standing in the doorway and staring. But it wasn't like this that... I said, think about it, Mr. Tanner's mum repeated. Like the old fey proverb, who needs a coach when you got a pumpkin? So long as she's in the room, it's like Versailles. Or, she added, a tart's boudoir, depending on your aesthetic standards. Any kind of decor, soft furnishing, old masters on the wall, you name it. When she's not in it, why should she care? It's the old light inside the fridge paradox. That's basically what the Fae are all about. Paul nodded. That made sense, except that the filing cabinet looked exactly the same as it had when he'd caught a glimpse of it the other night. The crummy old government surplus desk had looked like a priceless Louise Quince. Can we not hang about in here any longer than we need to? He said. It sounds silly, I know, but... He tailed off. For once, Mr. Tanner's mum wasn't grinning, leering, or fluttering so much as a single eyelash. You know, she said, there are days when you aren't quite as dumb as you look. You grab the top end. Let's get out of here before I throw up. Paul took hold of his end of the filing cabinet and, when Mr. Tanner's mum got to 3, he tried to lift. Bloody hell, he said, straightening up in pain. That thing's heavy. What's you got in it, for pity's sake? Mr. Tanner's mum scowled at him. There are also days, she said, when you make depleted uranium look like gossamer. Trust me, you don't want to ask questions like that in a place like this. Paul was puzzled. Depleted uranium? As in dense. Oh, right. So you don't think we should try taking the drawers out first, making it easier to carry? No. Whatever else Mr. Tanner's mum might have been, she surely was strong. Once she'd taken the weight at her end, all Paul really had to do was help steer and open the cashier's room door with his spare hand once they'd got there. Oh, great! Mel sang out as they backed the cabinet through the doorway. I've been waiting for that. Can you put it there in the corner, just next to the bookshelf? Thanks. Just a moment, Paul thought. You've been waiting for it? He asked. Oh, you bet. I hate having little piles of paper littered all over the floor. Paul straightened up, trying to ignore the chorus of protests from his back. You're going to keep stuff in here? Mel's looked at him. Paul, it's a filing cabinet. You put papers in them. You don't teach them the flute or take them on walking holidays looking at interesting old churches. But it's full. Mel's laughed and pulled open a drawer. No, it's not, she said. Look, empty, unless you count very old dead spiders. Paul looked at the empty drawer and then back at Mr. Tanner's mum, who lifted her shoulders in a tiny little shrug. Well, anyway, Paul said, there you go. I hope you're very happy together. Actually, it's not just for me. The top 3 drawers are for those Mortensen things. I gather you had a really fun time putting them in order. Yes, but you'll never get all of them in just 3 drawers. There were mountains of them. He paused. Mel's was stuffing armfuls of familiar-looking papers into the top drawer of the cabinet. There, she said. All done, unless you've got a few more you've been keeping back for a rainy day. That's all, Paul gasped, but Mel's just shrugged. It's got nice big drawers, she said, and to Paul's surprise, Mr. Tanner's mum didn't say a single word. So, she added, perhaps a little bit too casually, you free for lunch today? Paul was about to say something, yes, probably, when Mr. Tanner's mum pushed past him and stood between him and Melts. Sorry, she said, but he's taken. There'll be another one along in a minute. Oh, for God's sake, Paul spluttered, but he didn't get any further than that, because Mr. Tanner's mum elbowed him very subtly and very effectively in the solar plexus. He took a couple of steps back and thought about things for a bit, while Mel's and Mr. Tanner's mum stared at each other like a couple of multinational companies playing hostile takeovers. It was Mel's who broke eye contact first. Fine, she said. Tomorrow then, maybe. Mr. Tanner's mum's jawline had gone all Mount Rushmore. Now it relaxed into the classic grin. In your dreams, she said, and for some reason that seemed to bother Mel's. She turned her back on the pair of them and muttered something about having work she had to get on with. Mr. Tanner's mum clamped her hand around Paul's elbow with a grip like a mole wrench and steered him out of the room. Don't say anything, she said, and you could have sharpened carbon steel on her voice. Not one word. Got it? Paul was still too deeply interested in when it was going to stop hurting to argue. He'd explain it all to Mel's later, he decided, when the little red and green lights had stopped flashing behind his eyelids. Neither of them spoke as Mr. Tanner's mum conducted him down the stairs. The only thing missing, Paul reckoned, was the raincoat over their wrists. She let go of his elbow when they reached the ground floor. All right, she muttered, so maybe I shouldn't have hit you so hard. I'm a tad out of practice with my gentle hitting these days. But you've got to promise me, just this once, and it's only for the next few days or so. Try thinking with your brain instead of your... That was rather more than Paul could take, coming from her. Please, he said, with what he hoped was chilling courtesy, just leave me alone, will you? Forever? She shook her head at him. "I don't know," she said. "Why have I always got to pick the feckless, pathetic ones?" She walked away before he could think of anything to say. The rest of the week was almost disturbingly calm. A string of trivial pest control inquiries filtered through from other departments. Kaz Suslowich sent Paul a memo asking him to find out how to evict a bad luck dragon from the site of a multi-billion-dollar mall development in Singapore. The answer was, surprisingly, surrounding the perimeter with ordinary garden twine soaked in creosote, the smell of which bad luck dragons cannot abide. Mr. Tanner sent Christine down with a client's file and instructions to research cost-effective methods of dealing with an infestation of water nymphs in the swimming pool of a holiday camp on the North Lincolnshire coast. Paul spent 3 hours vainly searching for water nymph references in the office procedures manual. Finally, in frustration, he scribbled "sharks" in pencil on the cover of the file and went out to lunch. When he got back, the file had gone, and in its place was a handwritten note from Mr. Tanner saying, "Good idea, thanks." Professor Vansby himself, no less, summoned Paul to his office and asked him to draft a letter to a client advising on which varieties of garlic were more suitable for repelling which categories of vampire. Fortunately, Paul recalled having seen a Sutton seed catalogue in Benny Shumway's desk drawer, with post-it notes sticking out of the pages. He waited till Mells was out of the room, for some reason, and then sneaked in and got it. As he'd hoped, Benny had scribbled copious notes in the margins, and he was therefore able to advise the professor's client that fleur-de-lis and white pearl were both equally good against ordinary night-stalking vampires, but Mersey white or saltup were preferred in areas known to be infested with the rarer day-walking variety. "Excellent," the professor said, when Paul took him the draft. "You seem to have mastered a notoriously difficult discipline in a short time, which suggests a natural aptitude. You might consider specializing in pest control once you've completed your trial periods in other departments." The unexpected praise had hit Paul harder than Mr. Tanner's mum's elbow, and all he could do was grin feebly and shake his head. I don't think I'd like that," he mumbled. "Thanks all the same. Too much, well, killing and stuff, and I don't think I'd really cope with the mortal peril terribly well either." "You think so?" The professor seemed almost amused. "It seems to me you've been handling it admirably over the past 2 weeks. It took a moment for that one to sink in, by which time Paul had already started to say, "Well, it's the killing that really bothers me, so—" He stopped short and his mouth flopped open, like the tailgate of the lorry off the back of which good things fall. "Excuse me," he said. The professor raised an eyebrow. "Come now, Mr. Carpenter," he said. "You know perfectly well what I mean, and," he added, lifting his glasses and rubbing his eyelids, "I have to admit that I'm not sure if I'd been able to display such fortitude had I been in your position. You may have doubts about your courage, but I don't. Good afternoon." Somehow, staying in the professor's room once you'd been dismissed was simply impossible, like defying gravity. Paul stumbled back to his office in a daze and spent the rest of the afternoon staring at the door, trying very hard not to think about what he'd been told. Of course, he reflected bitterly, it would have to be bloody Friday today. Now have the whole weekend to skulk timidly in. Won't that be fun? At least while I'm here I've got work and stuff to keep me occupied, and maybe just possibly someone would come and help me if I was attacked and started screaming the place down. At home, no. Quickly, Paul applied his mental handbrake. Don't be silly, he told himself. It's all taken care of, thanks to dear, good, brave, wife, thoughtful Uncle Ernie, who'd gone out of his way to make sure that Paul inherited that spectacularly useful Sea Scout badge. If something nasty did come for him in the middle of the night, all he'd have to do would be to wave it under their nose, assuming they had noses, of course, and then they'd be off like rats up conduits. To think, he'd been worrying himself to a frazzle, and all the time the answer to his problems was right there. In his pocket. Or rather, it wasn't. Brief panic break, followed by detailed search of pockets, floor, desk drawers, pockets again. He was feeling in his jacket lining just in case it had slipped through a small hole, when he remembered the last time he'd seen the badge. He'd put it on top of a pile of Mortensen printouts, to keep the goblins off them until they were collected. That was a week ago, and he hadn't seen or even thought about the badge since. There was a remote chance it had fallen on the floor and got kicked onto the desk, but Paul disposed of that hope fairly quickly. The obvious conclusion, therefore, was that someone had taken it, either casual kleptomania, or because they wanted it, or because they didn't want him to have it. No prizes for guessing which hypotheses he inclined towards. The journey home that night was little short of terrifying. People kept coming up behind him. Not that unusual for London in the rush hour, but Paul had no way of knowing whether any of the scurrying lemmings squashing past him on the pavement or crushing against him on the bus was a disguised goblin or a shape-shifting fey assassin or even an unusually tall dwarf. To cap it all, the light bulb on the stairs had blown, and he had to creep up to his flat through shadows thicker and more menacing than anything he'd had to face on any of his trips to deposit the takings at the Bank of the Dead. When at last he was able to close his front door on the outside world, and he'd conducted an inch-by-inch search of the flat, torch in one hand, his most lethal weapon, which happened to be a cheese knife left over from when his parents moved to Florida, gripped in the other, he locked, chained and bolted the door and flumped bonelessly onto the sofa. 10 minutes later, he'd stopped shaking, and was starting to feel just a little foolish. It hadn't occurred to Paul before that maybe Professor Van Spee had simply been winding him up. True, the professor didn't look like he had a sense of humour, just as lions don't appear to have pink wings, but wasn't that a much likelier explanation than that someone was prepared to go to all the trouble of killing him? Who'd want to do that? Why murder someone who'd never really mattered in his entire life, a mere Mortensen collator and part-time filing cabinet shifter's assistant? Exactly. No motive. Getting into a state over a joke that had fallen flat in his own pathetic cowardice. Stumbling wearily into the kitchen, Paul traded the cheese knife, or to give it a suitable name now that he had adopted it as his personal sidearm, Edam Cleaver maybe, or Cheddar's Bane, for a can opener, and fixed himself a rather indifferent dose of beans on toast. Then he sat down to watch the news. Just ordinary, everyday stuff. Mundane scandals, normal crimes, the reassuringly familiar lies of politicians. Nothing about a civil war among the Fae, or werewolves in Surrey, or the release of hostages from the dungeons of Grendel's aunt. No big deal. The sitting room window exploded in a snowstorm of broken glass. Something large and heavy tumbled through. It was alive, caught up in the curtain, like an arena victim in a gladiator's net. The curtain rail and pelmet came away from the wall, and the writhing bundle crashed down on Paul's relatively new IKEA coffee table, crumbling it into dust and fragments. Paul was on his feet before he knew it, stumbling backwards until he couldn't go any further because of the goddamned interfering wall. The thing was bouncing up and down on the floor like an incompetent escapologist, fighting with the curtain and only succeeding in tangling itself further. Then it stopped moving for a whole second and a half. Enough time to run away in, provided your legs worked, which Paul's didn't. And then a tearing, slitting noise, and a bright steel tongue poked through the white curtain lining, like the beak of a baby chicken pecking through the eggshell. Paul stared in horrified fascination as a blade sawed its way along the length of the bundle. He'd seen a score of sci-fi movies where the alien monster fights its way out of its glistening cocoon before springing up, alert, gigantic, and ready for instant mayhem. He hadn't realised that they were really nature documentaries. But the thing that crawled painfully out of the cloth chrysalis wasn't a multiple-eyed, black carapaced nightmare. It was Ricky Wormtoter, dressed in faultless evening dress but no shoes or socks, and holding a sword. He struggled to his knees, looked up, saw Paul and grinned. "Thank goodness for that," he panted. "I couldn't remember if your flat's 36 or 38. And then he closed his eyes and slowly toppled over, taking out the footstool as he went. "Mr. Wormtoter?" Paul whispered. "Ricky, please." He reached out with his left hand, groping for the sword, which he had dropped. "Heart stinks. Haven't seen you in... Are you all right?" Ricky Wormtoter took a moment to answer. "Actually," he murmured, "no. Bump on the head. Probably 2 busted ribs. Couple of extra holes in places where there shouldn't be any. And there seem to be 3 of you going round and round like a windmill. Other than that, bloody awful. How's yourself?" Fine, thanks," Paul answered automatically. "Look, shall I call a doctor? No, sorry, Stacey, I'll phone for... Ricky shook his head. "Please, don't," he said. "Don't like hospitals." He lifted his head, and Paul could see 5 ragged parallel lines of caked blood across his cheek. "Afraid of needles, actually," he said. "I'll be fine if only I can get to a repair kit. You wouldn't happen to have one lying about, would you?" Sorry, Paul said. All I've got is aspirin and plasters. There used to be some cough mixture in the bathroom cabinet, but I think it must have been Sophie's because she took it with her when she walked out on me. Oh, bugger, I'm talking drivel again. Ricky laughed as he picked small needles of glass out of his hands. Doesn't matter, he said, with a slightly hysterical edge to his voice that Paul found rather frightening. What I really need is about a gallon of really strong black coffee. He paused, and a look of genuine terror filled his eyes. You have got coffee, haven't you? I think so, Paul said. Real coffee, not decaf. Paul said. He'd met coffee snobs before, the sort who looked at you like you were a cowpat or something just because you didn't have Lavazza double espresso or Jamaican red mountain grown on the southern slope of the hill facing the sea. It's only instant, he said. Nescafe, he admitted, in a very small voice. Perfect, said Mr. Wormtoter, visibly sagging with relief. Tell you what, you just lead the way and I'll make it myself. Ricky's idea of the proper way to make decent coffee turned out to be filling the cup half full with coffee powder and adding just enough cold water to turn it into syrup. Thanks, he sighed after his third dose. I ought to be all right now. Pleasure, Paul said. It's nice to see you again. Ricky leant against the kitchen worktop and then slid slowly down to the floor. Do me a favour, he said. Just nip and fetch my salt, would you? Only I don't really feel like getting up. Just for a moment. Rational explanation, Paul said to himself as he picked the sword up, using forefinger and thumb, as though retrieving a cigarette butt from a pint of milk. A bloke smashes in through the window in evening dress, cuts himself to ribbons but appears impervious to pain, falls over and demands very strong black coffee. Sherlock and Hercule and the boys wouldn't have had to work out very hard to figure that one out. Mr. Wormtoad had been out celebrating his release with the aid of intoxicating liquor and is not feeling well. But Paul had seen enough happy drunks to fill a students' union, and Ricky wasn't drunk. He glanced at the sword and shuddered. It was a remarkably sword-shaped sword, plain steel, smeared all over with some kind of reddish-black gunge, with several large chunks bitten out of the cutting edge. He held it away from himself at arm's length as he returned to the kitchen. You're probably wondering, Ricky mumbled, why is your evening dress? Actually, Paul had been wondering just that. You were on your way somewhere? He said. Ricky nodded. Couple of weeks ago. I can't remember how long. You lose track of time, understandably. I was going to some bloody stupid award ceremony. Hell of a lot of them in the hero business, as you'd expect. Always some pest in a tux chasing after you with the Witch Armor Lifetime Achievement Award for Romantical Management or some such garbage. Anyhow, I was just getting out of the limo, smiling for the cameras and all, and I suddenly felt terribly sleepy. Shit, I thought, here we go again. And when I came round, there I was, in the dark. Rat shuffling, water dripping, that whole scene. He laughed shrilly. I hate that. It makes you feel such an idiot, you know? Anyway, I thought about it. I had plenty of time for thinking. Came to the conclusion that someone must have slipped a Mickey in my tea back at the office. The thing is, though, who? There is only 2 people it could have been, and I can't see either of them. He frowned, shook his head as if to clear it. But on balance, he went on, out of 2 really, really unlikely candidates, you're just about the more believable by a tiny, tiny margin. Moving so fast that Paul couldn't follow how he did it, Ricky sprang to his feet and flicked the point of the sword up under Paul's chin. It pricked. Was it you? Ricky said. What Paul actually said was, squeak, rather than, of course not, don't be bloody ridiculous. He hoped very much that Mr. Wormtoter was fluent in articulate noises. 2 seconds, maybe 3. Then Ricky lowered the sword and flopped back down onto the floor like a bag of bones. It couldn't have been you, he said quietly. In which case... The sword slipped out of his hand and clattered onto the tiles. In which case I must be wrong about Mickey. I just can't believe he'd do that. His eyelids were drooping, his head lolled sideways. Please, he whispered, help me stay awake. This is really quite important. Sure, Paul mumbled. How? Cold water. Splash, please. Paul filled a saucepan from the tap, thinking, well, how often does the boss ask you to drench him in cold water? He poured. Thanks, Ricky said, shaking himself like a wet dog. That's much better. You're being a great help, you know that? Carry on this way, you'll be in the frame for best sidekick at next year's Percy's. Gosh, Paul said neutrally. Ricky, do you think you could possibly tell me what's going on? He hesitated, intrigued beyond endurance. Percy's? Pathful Awards, Ricky said. Scunthorpe Heroism Festival. Generally regarded in the trade as a good indication of form for the Fairies. But I never bother going unless I'm shortlisted. Right, Paul muttered. Ricky Wormtoter yawned. Do you think you could make me some more coffee? He said. A bit stronger this time, if that's okay. Only I think the last lot's beginning to wear off. There was only enough coffee powder left for 4 more cups, but Ricky announced that would probably be enough to keep him going, at least until Starbucks opened in the morning. Mustn't fall asleep again, see? He explained. Vitally important. Life and death. Ah, right, Paul thought. Only, are you sure you should be drinking that stuff? He said. Isn't caffeine terribly bad for concussion? Ricky looked at him as though he hadn't got a clue what Paul meant. And then he laughed. Believe me, he said, concussion's the least of my problems right now. No, the reason I mustn't fall asleep is I mustn't dream. No more dreams, not ever, if I can possibly help it. Had enough dreams to last me. He looked up. You do know about dreams, don't you? Dreams, the Fae, the whole shooting match. There comes a point when striving to cope and being a brave little soldier cease to have any meaning. Dreams, Paul repeated. You mean like when you're asleep? Of course that kind of dream, Ricky said, frowning. Bloody hell, didn't anybody tell you when you joined the firm? You mean to say, he went on, his anger growing steadily, that you've been happily getting into bed and going to sleep and having dreams as though there was nothing to worry about, and you don't know even the basic safety precautions. Paul stared at him. Is there something to worry about? He said. Are you kidding? Dreams, for God's sake. That's like saying, does it really matter if you dive into a swimming pool full of nitroglycerin holding a lighted stick of dynamite? I don't know of all the bloody stupid, irresponsible... Oh, come on, Paul couldn't help saying. Yes, I get some pretty weird dreams these days, but that can't hurt you, can it? I mean, it's all just stuff getting played back in your subconscious, isn't it? How can you possibly come to any harm if you're just sleeping peacefully? For a moment, Ricky had trouble making his voice work. When he finally spoke, he was scarily calm. Tell me, he said, how do most people die? Paul didn't like the sound of that. Old age, he ventured. Illness? Most people, Ricky replied quietly, die in their sleep. He turned his face away for a moment and then looked back. Sleep's a bit like water. It's fine so long as you don't try breathing it. Listen, he said. I'm a pretty courageous guy. You don't have to take my word. I've got a shelflet of gongs and stuff to prove it. From Hero Monthly Bravest Newcomer 87 right up to my 2003 Freddy for Best Daredevil. He paused for a moment, simpering ever so slightly, and then went on. But you know what? There's one thing that scares me so much I can't bear thinking about it. I'm afraid I'll die in my bed, with my eyes shut, sleeping. I know the Fae, and I trust them about as far as I could sneeze them out of my ear. Now, do you understand? No. Oh, for crying out. Ricky pulled himself together with an effort. All right, let's take this a step at a time. You know about the Fae, right? What they are, where they come from. Paul thought about that. No, he said. Fine. Ricky settled his back more comfortably against the side of the fridge door, and then went on. The Fae are dreams, Paul. That is the very essence of what they are. They start to exist when one of us, a real person, sees them in our sleep. And normally, that's the only place they can exist, inside our dreams. In a way, it's a good existence. They don't need to eat or sleep or work. They never get old or sick. They don't have to bother with relationships or office politics or guilt tips or even being bored out of their skulls. Once we created them, generally speaking, they can be whatever they want inside the dream. But they can't exist outside that little cartoon speech bubble we make when we're asleep. And they've got to have someone to dream them, carry on dreaming them, or they just go pop and fade away. In the sense, they're like the dead. You know about them. They can only keep existing so long as someone remembers them. But the Fae never existed at all. They've never been solid or real, just pictures in somebody's mind. That's why they're so resentful, and it makes them dangerous. Oh, Paul said. It seemed the only appropriate comment in the circumstances. Dangerous, Ricky repeated. He was talking mostly to himself now, Paul thought. It wouldn't matter, only they're so goddamn clever and resourceful. They found out a long time ago that if one of us dies in the middle of a dream, if they're really quick, they can slip through the gap and change places with the dying guy. They become sort of real. The dying guy stranded in the kingdom of the Fae. You wouldn't like it there, Paul. I've been there. It's not so good. He swallowed and took a couple of deep breaths. You know why my Viking ancestors were all so dead keen on dying in battle? You can't fight in your sleep. It's so much safer getting your head split open with an axe. I see, Paul lied. So that's why it's dangerous going to sleep? Part of it, Ricky said, shaking his head. There's more. I said that if they sneak out when someone dies, they can sort of exist. Very much sort of. They still need someone to dream them, see? It's just that while they're being dreamed, they can walk about and talk and do stuff over here in real life. He paused for breath and then continued, which means that whoever's dreaming them can't be allowed to wake up, or they go straight back to where they came from, and no chance of ever getting through again. So you see, the ones who've managed to get through are completely ruthless. They'll do anything to anybody to keep from getting sent home. And if it means getting hold of some poor bastard and putting him to sleep for the rest of his life, like a coma, I suppose. Only it's worse, because you can feel what's being done to you all the time. Well, they don't give a damn. That's what the Fae are, Paul. They're parasites and predators, and if they get their hooks into you, it's far, far worse than being dead. Believe me. But that's... Paul shook his head slowly. That's awful. Hang on, though. The Countess, she's one of them, isn't she? She's more than that. She's the boss, the queen of the Fae. Say so on the headed note paper in case you haven't looked. Bloody hell, Paul said. But if she's that bad, that dangerous, why the hell don't you all do something about it? Stick a stake through her heart or something. Ricky grinned feebly. There are several reasons, he said. I guess the main one is that she brings in about $7.25 million in fees every year. We're running a business after all, and the overheads just keep on shooting up. I mean, take business rates. Paul made a sort of strangled noise that made himself stay calm. All right, he said. Now, I know about the bloody Fae, but that doesn't explain why it's so dangerous to go to sleep. I mean, why would they be after me, particularly? You can dream, Ricky replied. In fact, you do it rather well. My guess is that's why Judy was so dead keen to hire you when you came along for interview. She can smell a good dreamer upwind 100 miles away. Now, there's things you can do to keep safe, charms and talismans and stuff, but nobody seems to have told you about them, and that bothers me, you know? It bothers you, Paul echoed. Ricky nodded. Don't get the idea they're 100% bulletproof, by the way, he added, because they aren't, or else I wouldn't have needed to drink all your coffee. But they're like a burglar alarm. Most of the time they're enough to make the Fae decide you're more trouble than you're worth, so they go away and pick on someone else. But if they're determined to get you, it's pretty hard to keep them out. It's like putting the chain on the door when the bad guys have a battering ram. He yawned again, such a huge yawn he could have swallowed a cross-channel ferry. I have to go, he said. It's not safe for you while I'm here. Actually, let's be honest, it won't be a hell of a lot safer for you after I leave, but it's worth clinging on to those few probability points. And anyhow, I've got a whole lot of stuff I need to do before I show up at the office on Monday. He frowned, his face reflecting the struggle he was having trying to focus his mind. By the way, he said, how did you get on with that Wyvern in the cast machine? I sat on it. Ricky nodded vaguely. Way to go, he said, best foot forward. And if feet aren't going to cut it, use what it takes to get the job done. Is there a back door, a fire escape? No, I mean, I don't think so. I've never seen one, but forget it. Have you got any rope? In the end, Paul knotted his dressing gown cord to his spare belt in the extension lead for Sophie's hairdryer. She'd taken the dryer but had forgotten the lead, and hung on for grim death as Ricky scrambled down from the bathroom window onto the flat roof beneath. Last Paul saw of him was a quick wave of the hand before he vanished into the darkness. Jesus, Paul thought, and since he was all out of coffee, made himself a cup of tea. Clearly there were enough implications in what Ricky had told him to scare him to death 15 times over. The sensible course of action, therefore, was to think about something else. Also, it was imperative that he stay awake for the rest of his life. Absolutely no question about that. Whatever else he did or did not do, closing his eyes, even for a split second, was out of the question. Sleep for his own. Just say no. Zzz. He dreamed that he was sitting at his kitchen table, his head cushioned on his arms, fast asleep, with an untouched cup of strong, sweet tea 6 inches from his left elbow. He dreamed that as he slept, Countess Judy de Castelbianco walked in through the shattered window, and behind her followed a dozen or so very tall, very blonde children, cloaked and hooded and carrying strange objects he didn't recognise, but which he knew were various kinds of weapon. It'd be really nice if I could wake up now, he thought, as Countess Judy stood over him, grabbed his hair and pulled his head up. How the hell can I sleep through all this, he wondered. That thing with the hair has got to hurt like buggery. You'd have thought I'd wake up screaming right now. No such luck, though. He watched as Judy tilted his head over to expose the side of his neck, and held out her other hand, into which one of the tall children silently placed a long, thin knife. What was it Ricky had said about people dying in their sleep? Judy was positioning his head just so, with what looked like the skill that comes with an awful lot of practice. She was looking for the whatchamacallit vein, because his head was full of dreams. Paul couldn't think of the right word. Not arterial, because that was roads. Not vernacular, that was slang. Not judicial, that was laws and stuff. Jugular, that's it, looking for the jugular vein. Didn't take her long. The knife looked like it was plenty sharp. That was a good thing, right? Won't feel a thing. Promise. Pity, he thought. My life's been like a book you can borrow from the library, but never get around to reading until it's due back, and in a second or two it'll be over. Not that I'd ever have got round to doing anything with it, justifying my existence, making the world a better place. It was just a life, and most of the time it was either boring or horrible. Even so, I hadn't finished with it yet, and already here was the wait to clear away the dirty plates. Pathetic, really, and now her hand was on his shoulder, gripping like a G-clamp, shaking him. "Wake up!" Ricky Wormtoter shouted in his ear. "Wake up, for fuck's... That's better, now look at me." Paul opened his eyes. Am I dead?" he asked. "Only from the neck up. Bloody hell, Paul, what did I tell you about not falling asleep?" "It was... excuse me." Paul floundered to his feet like a newborn foal and sprint-slithered to the bathroom, where he was sick with spectacular energy, though his projectile placement was indifferent. Then he staggered back to the kitchen. She was here," he muttered, dabbing at his face and neck with a towel. "She was just about to..." "All right," Ricky said, wincing. "Spare me the full narrative, just as well I forgot this and had to come back for it," he added, showing Paul the sword. "Oh, I got to use this on the way, from the all-night shop up the road. Dow Egberts," he explained, carefully placing a huge jar of coffee granules on the tabletop. "Since you'll be pretty much living on the stuff for a while, I thought you might as well have a brand that doesn't taste of bitumen dissolved in piss. In fact, if I were you, I'd get a proper cafetiere and some Wittard's mocha. False economy is not your friend." Paul nodded. Thanks," he said. I believe you now," he added. But why would she want to kill me? I never did her any harm." Ricky was looking at him oddly. "Are you sure about that?" he said. "Or maybe it's the other way around entirely. Maybe you did her a really good turn, something very useful indeed, in which case," he explained, "that makes you an accessory." Paul frowned. "You mean like a belt or a handbag?" "All right, accomplice. At the very least a witness. The Fae are red-hot on attention to detail. Have you been doing much for her at the office lately?" As a matter of fact, yes. She had me sorting those Mortensen printouts for the best part of a week." "Mortensen printouts," Ricky repeated. "That doesn't make any sense. Why would she bother killing you if all you've done is the filing?" "Oh, well, I guess it's just that she doesn't like you very much." He yawned, like a lion at the dentist's. "You should be all right now," he said. "Now that she's been rumbled, it's not likely she'll be back tonight. But a couple of pints of that coffee ought to make doubles sure. What you really need, of course, is something like a 7th level shield. I've got a spare back home that I could lend you, but I won't be going that way for a couple of weeks." Just a moment," Paul said. "What's a whatever it is level shield look like?" "It can't be anything," Ricky replied, shrugging. "Pencil, watchstop, scruffy old paperback book. The usual thing is a badge of some sort, something inconspicuous you can pin inside your jacket." "Would it scare goblins?" Ricky laughed. Scare them, he said. Just being in the same room would fry their tiny brains. Touching it physically burns them. Why? I think I've got one already, Paul replied thoughtfully. At least I did have, but I left it on my desk at the office and now I can't find it. Ricky was impressed. Where'd you... No, don't tell me now. I really do have to get to move on. Run errands, see to chores. If we're both alive and conscious on Monday, you can tell me then. He frowned. Far be it from me to dictate how you run your life, he said, but in your shoes I'd fix that window before anything else nasty comes through it. It's a little-known fact that the Fae have real difficulty getting in somewhere if the doors and windows are shut. Properly shut, mind. Though only open a teeny crack, that'll do. For a moment Paul had no idea what he meant. It's all very well saying that, he said mournfully, but where am I supposed to get a pane of glass at this time of night? Not to mention putty and... He stopped. Oh! He said. I see. I've forgotten I can do that sort of stuff. Ricky grinned at him. Give it a try, he said. Of course, Paul didn't really know how to use magic, just as nobody knows how to fly, but falling from an aeroplane just comes naturally. How do I start? He asked nervously. Is there something I should say, or... Whatever else Ricky might have been, he was impressively patient. Just think, he said. Think about how the window looked before it got smashed. Then reflect on how a smashed window is inherently wrong, whereas an unsmashed window is one how things should be in an ideal world. Yes, but, Paul started to say, but Ricky shushed him and pointed at the window. Paul saw both their reflections in the unblemished glass. You did that, didn't you? Paul asked. Ricky shook his head. All you really need is confidence, he said. You've got the basic skills. You just need to convince yourself that you can use them. Now then, remember, door closed, window shut, curtains drawn, and last but not least, toilet seat down. You can probably chance it and get some sleep tonight, or what's after tonight. But if you want to play it absolutely safe, your best bet is a couple of handfuls of stale crumbs in the bed and lots of coffee. Now, I really have to go. Sword in hand, Ricky crossed to the door, opened it a crack, and peeked out. Good luck, he added, and slipped away, closing the door quietly behind him. Just as Paul realised what he'd just said and called out, Why have I got the basic skills? Whereupon the Yale catch clicked firmly home. Once upon a time, Paul remembered as he waited for the front door of 70 St. Mary Axe to open, weekends shot past so fast that bystanders were sent flying by the slipstream. As soon as you stumbled out of bed on Saturday morning, it was time to go to bed on Sunday, so as to be up bright and early for work the next day. He remembered mentioning this effect to Benny Shumway, who confirmed that time got distinctly odd around the 6th and 7th day, and went on to tell him about an early prototype time machine that J.W.W. had built in the late 1890s, based on exactly that principle, by stacking up a series of artificially generated weekends. The designers reckoned it ought to be possible to accelerate the would-be time traveller several years into the future. The project had foundered only because the return mechanism, which was based on the extreme nostalgia of looking at photographs of old school chums, was too erratic to be relied on, with the result that at some point in 2007, the firm was going to have to pay out 109 years' worth of accumulated back pay to the junior associate who had piloted the first manned test launch. The previous couple of days, by contrast, had crawled by like hourly paid snails. Between boredom, exhaustion, and caffeine poisoning, Paul was practically on his knees. Only the thought of what he was going to say to Countess Judy at around 9:02 on Monday morning had sustained him through the ordeal. He had had plenty of time to choose his words. Eventually he'd prepared his speech down to 2 words, and one of those was a pronoun. He wasn't looking forward to the interview, but for once he was absolutely determined to follow it through. The 2 words were, I quit, and he got them out without corpsing, stammering, or mumbling. Excuse me. I said I quit, Paul repeated. You quit what? Smoking? I resign, Paul explained. I don't want this job anymore. I'm leaving. Oh. She had the sheer effrontery to look surprised. Really? Why? Paul was now seriously over budget on words, but this wasn't a time for parsimony. You know why, he said. No, I don't. Yes, you do. No, I don't. Yes, you bloody well do, Paul banged the Countess's desk with his clenched fist. "Ouch!" he added, as a stapler flew across the room, leaving a staple embedded in the side of his hand. "You tried to kill me." "Did I really? When was that?" "You know perfectly. Friday night, when I fell asleep at the kitchen table. You got into my dream and you were going to kill me, only somebody woke me up," he amended sloppily. "You had a fucking great knife and you were going to stab me or slice me open." "Oh," Countess Judy said, shrugging. "That? There was no harm done, though, and I found someone else, another donor, so you're no longer at risk. Nothing to worry about, you see?" It was just as well that there weren't any itinerant haberdashers in the building at that moment, since for 2 pins Paul would have punched her in the face. No harm done," he repeated. "You were going to... hang on," he said. You found another donor? You mean you killed someone else?" She shrugged again. "Hardly killed," she said. "I managed to locate a donor who was terminally ill. In fact, we arrived when he was on the very point of death. Salvage, you see, not homicide. We do have certain ethical standards." The anger was making it hard for Paul to speak. "I wasn't on the point of bloody death," he ground out. "There wasn't anything wrong with me." Into the Countess's bright silvery eyes came a curious glow that Paul couldn't remember having seen before. It sobered him up from a white-hot fury to terror in about the 15th of a second. "In your case," she said, "there are special circumstances. Rest assured, I would never, ever presume to take a life to which I wasn't legally entitled." Curious how some people have a certain knack and others don't. Paul had hoped that his 2 words would have settled the whole business and left him free and clear. Free, to be precise, to change his name, grow a beard, and start a new life for himself in Nova Scotia. In the event, they'd proved hopelessly inadequate. Countess Judy's 2 words, on the other hand, were the oncoming truck, and he was the hedgehog. "Excuse me," he said. "Legally entitled?" She nodded curtly. "We have to be most particular about the legal side of things," she said. "In our position, unauthorized harvesting could lead to the most undesirable complications. In your case, however, no such problems would arise, as we have clear, unencumbered title." It was like swimming in shark-infested custard. "Just a moment," Paul mumbled. "Simply because I signed your rotten bloody contract when I joined." Now Countess Judy was actually laughing, admittedly not a laugh that had anything to do with humour. "Of course not," she said. "Your terms of employment are strictly limited to your work obligations. I was referring to our legal claim to your life." "My life?" Another 2 words with the stopping power of a ton weight. "You own my life?" "That's right." "Really? How come?" Now she opened her eyes wide, a show of surprise. "My purchase, of course. We bought you." 3 words this time. Paul took a step back, but that wasn't sensible. His legs didn't seem to be functioning terribly well. "Bought?" he said. "Who the hell from?" "Your parents, naturally. Come now, Mr. Carpenter. Please don't ask me to believe you weren't aware of the fact. You have a certain degree of basic intelligence, even though you often seem to be at pains to conceal it. Do you really believe your parents could have afforded to move to Florida on the strength of your father's savings?"